Hello, my name is Joe Leeson Schatz. I got brought into the eco-ability movement and disability studies about a year and a half ago. And what's interesting to me is that while I'm involved in this movement, it's a movement that I'm not necessarily also directly a part of. And so one of the things that we talk about when we talk about animal rights is that animal liberation initiatives is one of the few initiatives that exist that are led by the oppressors. I.e., it's the humans who are leading the call for animal liberation, not the animals themselves. In this instance, in relation to disability studies, I am not someone who identifies as having a disability, although I recognize that there has been points in my life where I have lived with disabilities, and there will be points in my life where I have things that will also make me grapple with disabilities. It is not something that is currently part of my identity in a sense that most people understand disability as. However, at the same point, I feel very close and connected with people who do identify as disabled, because I think that there is an importance of linking up different forms of struggles with one another and understanding how oppressions are disconnected. And so the point of this presentation is sort of beginning the groundwork of theorizing of how to be an ally within the disability studies movement, opposed to, what is disability studies in an academic sense, or opposed to, what can we do in order to tangibly change things, is what does it mean to be an ally? To me, being an ally is very different than being in coalition or in solidarity with someone. And while they're similar, there are differences. In my mind, when someone is in a coalition, they agree not only to work for the same ends, but they agree on the tactics and the means to go about doing it. And so coalitions are oftentimes I see as temporary arrangements between different groups of people and different organizations to come together to achieve an objective and agree on the means to be able to achieve that objective. And then when the objective is achieved, maybe go their own way, maybe continue working together on other initiatives and things like that, but certainly not something that is entirely permanent or where there's a bunch of diverse tactics that are being deployed that are in disagreement with one another. Solidarity I see as a type of coalitional practice where people sign on and essentially will sacrifice their own ideas or their own avenues of resistance for those people who they're in solidarity with. Right? So to be in solidarity with, as a white person, to be in solidarity with Black Power movements, it means that regardless of one's own thoughts of how race and racism should be addressed within any sort of context, that agency should be entirely sacrificed to the Black individuals who are actually organizing it. Because to be in solidarity means that you are following those people who are at the helm, those people who are leading the charge against a various different form of oppression in order to be able to challenge it. And so the individual ideas of someone who is not the identity, i.e. the white person within the Black Power movement, is not the central focus of what that movement is about. Rather, the person who's in solidarity is there in order to help assist in those avenues and means of resistance and modes of engagement that are necessary in order to be able to advance the struggles of the people that are in charge. Which is different than being in a coalition where one's voice is not necessarily entirely sacrificed, but rather there is an arranged agreement upon how those tactics go down. Being an ally I see as different than both being in coalition with someone or standing in solidarity with someone. And the reason why I think this is because being an ally means that while the goals that should be achieved at the end are the same, the diverse ways of getting there can be different. And so people have all different forms of agendas, different ideas in order to figure out the way in which modes of resistance should be engaged, the way that resistance should be sequenced, the way that different forms of activism could work, right? Some people within the animal liberation movement or animal rights movement, both movements are different, think that reformism is beneficial. Others think it's destructive. These people cannot work in coalition very often with one another because they are diametrically opposed in the ways that they think that strategies of resistance towards animal-based oppression should be engaged. However, they can be allies with one another because the goal of both are the same, which is to advance the cause of non-human animals in order to lessen the impact of the oppression that they face. And so they're allies because they're working towards the same goal, but the tactics that they take are often contradictory or in opposition with one another. So to be an ally as someone who doesn't identify as disabled within people within disability studies, means that I believe that there is an importance to be able to link up those struggles and figure out ways in order to advance, ways in order to challenge things like ability privilege, while at the same time not necessarily entirely sacrificing one's own thoughts about how these things should be able to be engaged. And the reason why I think this is important and why I prioritize ally versus coalition or solidarity in these movements is that oftentimes when talking with people within disability studies about things like veganism or vegetarianism, there's a criticism of the way that veganism and vegetarianism is promoted as sort of the healthy choice, or the choice that is correct for one's health, that's better for, this, that, or the other thing. And I'm not thinking of things like, PETA is, blatantly offensive, like Got Autism campaign, which is not really based in science that shows any sort of link, doesn't understand the way that autism is constructed. I'm thinking more of the ways in which, like, eating vegetables is basically intrinsically healthier than eating saturated fat from McDonald's and things like that. And this is important to me because when I've engaged in some of these conversations, there's been a sort of academic maneuver to then criticize, well, what do you mean by healthy, or what is a healthy body? And a challenge that vegetarians and vegans should not utilize health as one of the arguments in order to be able to convince people to stop consuming animal flesh. This is something that I'm a type of ground that I'm unwilling to cede, because I think that many people who I engage with choose to go vegetarian or vegan because of the health benefits, and to stop talking about that simply because that it ascribes to notions of health which might be normative necessarily seeds a form of avenue and a form of resistance that I think is important to be able to advance forward. However, at the same time, being an ally means that I don't just disregard people's opinions who of the people who are identify as being disabled as being like, well, doesn't make any sort of sense. Rather, it means that I have to take seriously their comments, so that way when I do talk about what it means to be healthy as a vegetarian or as a vegan, that those things aren't forgotten about when I have these conversations, and recognize that there really isn't a single mode of which health can be initiated, but rather something that is constantly evolving and means different things for different people in different places. And so being an ally means that you can continue those tactics without necessarily having to fully give them up. So these things are sort of in regards to like tactics that are deployed. And so being an ally while taking things seriously means also that, one does not necessarily have to give up a tactic if they think that is important for advancing a form of agenda that they think is important, as long as it doesn't undermine or get in the way of advancing the other agenda, right? So when PETA does things that say, like their Got Autism campaign, that's not being an ally with people within disability studies, because it has it doesn't really take into consideration any of those forms of thinking, and it's not working for the same endpoint, and it's actually in a lot of points directly undermining the ability to advance a more a better awareness about the way that disability studies exist and the way that ability privilege interacts with one another. Another thing in terms of being an ally is that when language choices become offensive to individuals, that is very important to sort of modify or change one's language, opposed to sort of making defenses for one's language, right? So there's a big difference between willing to, saying that, no, I think this tactic of, say, promoting vegetarianism, veganism as healthy is something that I'm unwilling to give up, as it means to, utilize a word like spastic, or, that's just stupid, or whatever else. Like, those sort of things are not integral to being able to advance one's campaign. And so it's difficult but easy at the same time in order to modify one's language. So as an ally, when people point out things like a certain form of discourse that you're using is problematic, it's important in order to be able to just willingly change that form of language without criticizing or saying that now I need to maintain that language for understanding, because that language is not essential to advancing these sort of campaigns. So when promoting vegetarianism and veganism as a healthy initiative, I make sure that the way I talk about health doesn't subscribe to a singular form of what constitutes a healthy body, but rather is pitch to the individual who I'm dealing with and what they would understand a healthy body or a healthy lifestyle to be. So that way it's not like, well, there is a BMI index and that we must be able to do it, because there is problems that necessarily uphold certain forms of ability privilege over others when people just talk about health unproblematically. And so these are things, an example of how the way that when someone hears something is problematic but still thinks that it's important for the types of resistance or avenues of change that they're focusing on, that they could be able to change the language that they utilize while keeping the tactics in the same sort of sense. And so, for instance, when people criticized Weird Al's most recent video for using the word spastic, instead of defending his language choices, which a lot of musician artists do, is being like, oh no, it's not offensive, or I mean something else, he immediately apologized for it, said he didn't know that term was that term carried that form of meaning, and sort of disassociated from that terminology. And so that, in my mind, is an example of where Weird Al became an ally with people within disability studies or people with disabilities, because there was an immediate awareness that since he does not identify as having disability, but there were people who were finding this term offensive, he immediately then agreed with them and then changed the way that he would interact in order to be able to do that. And so in order to be an ally, it requires an honest effort to truly listen and understand the types of things that are being talked by people who are actually within those movements. Doesn't mean giving up those sort of things that you think are important to advance, those things that you're deeply concerned with, but it does mean that there has to be an honest effort to listen and adapt one's campaigns and languages around the ways that they're conceiving how people who are allies should be doing things. Integral to this is understanding that all oppressions are fundamentally interconnected and that there must be an understanding of one's privilege, right? As a white male, I have a lot of privileges that are associated with that. But in addition, I am what most people in society would consider fully able-bodied, which has a whole host of other privileges that are associated with that. And with privilege comes responsibility, but also with privilege means that one has to use those privileges in order to undermine those structures that are in place that help allow that privilege to be privileged over other individuals. And so by understanding how oppressions are interconnected from a privilege standpoint, it's important to recognize that my own objectives, or what I think is most important to be achieved, is an objective or a form of achievement that comes from a privileged understanding of how the world operates or how oppression operates, which gets back to why it's important for people inhabiting my social location in order to be able to listen, in order to reform the ways that they conceive of what is important, so that way the privilege is kept in check, but that privilege is also utilized in order to be able to challenge the various forms of oppression that are interconnected with one another. Otherwise, what ends up happening as a white male who is for animal liberation, animals would end up becoming before all else, before any form of human-based campaigns. And that is something that there's a radical, negative response to by people within race communities, within sexual liberation communities and things like that, who criticize vegetarian and vegan activists oftentimes for saying that animals are more important than people. I don't think that animals are more important than people, but at the same time I don't think people are more important than non-human animals, because we are all essentially animals. What is important, though, is that when engaging with different groups or different identities, that what comes to the forefront, or what I rally around, or what is important for me to be able to challenge, shouldn't be universal in all instances, but rather needs to be able to adapt to the conditions that exist within it, so that way my privileged perspective is not what exists at the forefront of what I do, but rather is part of what I do in being an ally by listening to those others who actually participate within the struggles that I think are absolutely crucial in order to undermining things like social injustice. And so to be an ally to people with disabilities means not only listening to what they mean or what they care about in terms of the language that I use, but also what they take as being the avenues of resistance that are most important in order to be able to undermine things like ability privilege. And that means taking them on their word for it and seriously assessing what that means in order to be a lifelong ally for disability studies, in order to be able to advance a form of understanding or animal liberation that doesn't come at the expense of it, and come up with campaigns that promote veganism and vegetarianism as healthy to the detriment of people who might be quote-unquote fat, right? This type of understanding, get rid of the blubber campaigns and stuff like that, are directly offensive and undermines things that would actually promote a worldview that would not have
Yes.
fatness as being a automatically negative connotation. And so by doing these sort of things, we could form a form of, there could be a form of animal liberation that can be theorized that does not base itself off of ability privilege, that directly undermines the struggles of those who are disabled.